The Warning Bell, Boston. A March morning in 1765. Fog still hung low over the slate rooftops and uneven cobblestone streets near the harbor. From the steeple of Old North Church, a short, cold chime rang out dry and hollow, like a signal of something approaching. Inside a small print shop near Market Square, Samuel Adams hunched over a hand press, carefully lifting the first newspaper of the day from the still warm metal plate. The bold black letters quivered under the pale morning light. Parliament passes the Stamp Act, a tax on liberty. He laid the paper on the table, breathing in the scent of fresh ink, slowly shaking his head. Samuel's eyes didn't stray from the headline. He understood this was not just news, it was a warning, a turning point. The door creaked open. James Otis, a well-known lawyer in Boston, stepped inside, his coat still dusted from the street. In his hand was a rolled-up document, and his face was tense. "They've really done it," he said, his voice low and firm. "They've taxed us without even asking." Samuel didn't reply. He simply slid the newspaper across the table. Otis scanned the headline and gave a dry smile. "A tax on liberty, well said. That phrase will wake this town up." Outside, the sun began to rise, casting a golden sheen over Boston's main streets. At the city square, a crowd began gathering around a boy, waving a stack of fresh papers and shouting, "Hot off the press! Parliament, taxes, paper Americans say no." A group of cobblers and blacksmiths leaned in. One of them shouted, "Otis is right. No taxation without representation." The crowd roared back in agreement. The chant spread like wildfire through the market, across the wooden buildings of King Street. Not far from there, in a red-roofed office near King's Chapel, Andrew Oliver, appointed tax distributor for Boston, sat, reading a copy of the newly passed act sent from London. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. A native of Boston himself, he knew how the people of this town thought. He knew well, enforcing this law will not be easy. The Stamp Act required that all legal documents, licenses, contracts, newspapers, even academic papers, be printed on official government-issued, paper-stamped, and taxed. And who would be collecting that tax? Oliver, among others. On the streets, the reaction was swift. Shopkeepers refused to stock stamped paper. Lawyers declared they would not use taxed documents for contracts. Printers like Samuel Adams quietly stopped acknowledging the royal seal. That evening, inside the dimly lit Green Dragon Taverna, secret meeting place for Patriot Stention filled the air. Under flickering oil lamps, Samuel, Otis, and a handful of young tradesmen, ship captains, and the young lawyer, John Adams, gathered around a wooden table. "This isn't about money," Samuel began, voice controlled but resolute. "This is about dignity." They see us as subjects without a voice, little more than slaves. Otis continued, eyes sharp as blades. Our homes and our children won't even know what freedom means. A curly-haired young man at the end of the table, John Hancock, leaned forward. So what if we don't comply, don't pay, don't use their paper? Will they send troops? Samuel held Hancock's gaze. Maybe, but if every colony stands together, no law can stand. And so the idea of resistance began to take root, quietly, but with purpose. Blacksmiths carved the words "liberty" or "death" onto walls. Print shops began issuing underground newsletters. Informal town meetings spread through New England like sparks seeking kindling. Then came the inevitable. Early one April morning, a straw effigy was seen hanging from a large elm near the town square. A crude sign on its chest read, "Andrew, Oliver's Cellar of Freedom." A crowd gathered. Some threw stones at Oliver's office. By sunset, his home had been ransacked, windows shattered, books and papers burned in the yard. His family fled that night under the cover of darkness. But they shared something deeper: anger. Not blind rage, but the kind of anger born from being dismissed too long. They didn't want to overthrow the king. They just wanted to be heard. That night, while most of Boston slept, Samuel Adams sat alone by a flickering candle. He began to pen the first lines of a petition to Parliament. No representation, no representation. This is not just our right. It is the foundation of a free people. Outside his window, the waters of the Charles River lapped gently at the harbor edge. A city was awakening. A people were beginning to ask, if we cannot speak for ourselves, then who are we? And so, from a seemingly harmless act of taxation, the warning bell had rung. None of them could know it yet. But 10 years later, from these same damp streets, a revolution would rise. History would change forever. The Stamp Act, from London to the New World London. Early 1765. A cold winter fog blanketed the cobblestone streets. Inside the weighty chambers of the British Parliament, Prime Minister George Grenville sat in contemplation over a desk cluttered with documents. Before him lay the draft of a new ACTA solution. He believed both reasonable and urgent to recoup the staggering costs of the recent 7 Years' War. We shed blood to defend the American colonies from the French, he declared to fellow members of Parliament. Now it's time for them to contribute. There was no objection and no colonial representatives to voice concern. They were an ocean away. With little debate, the Stamp Act was passed. The act required that every piece of paper from contracts, wills, and newspapers to sermons used in the American colonies must be printed on official royal stamped paper. This paper could only be sold by agents appointed by the Crown. No stamp no legality. April 1765, New York Harbor. A British ship docked, carrying large crates bearing the royal seal. But this time, it wasn't tea or goods, it was stamped paper, the first physical sign of a command from London reaching across the Atlantic. News spread like wildfire along the eastern seaboard. In Philadelphia, printing guilds held uneasy meetings. Some editors grew anxious. If we must pay to print the news, one asked, who will still dare criticize the government? Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, then representing the colonies in London, wrote home, "The law is passed, but the future is unwritten." He urged, calm but warned, that patience could not last forever. Virginia, May 1765. In the House of Burgesses, a young but fiery lawyer named Patrick Henry rose to deliver a bold speech. His voice rang clear. Only our own assemblies have the right to tax us. No representation, no taxation, some gasped. A few whispered, he insults the king. But the fury had now found words. Boston, summer 1765. The city air was thick, heavy like a storm was coming. The news of the act ignited rage. At the corner of Essex Street, a straw effigy labeled Andrew Oliver, the appointed stamp distributor for Massachusetts, was strung up on the Liberty Tree. Beneath its branches, hundreds gathered, fists raised, chanting against taxation. The next day, a mob stormed Oliver's home. Windows shattered, furniture thrown into the street, documents set ablaze. Trembling, Oliver was forced to read his resignation aloud under the Liberty Tree, surrounded by roaring cheers. And not only Boston, all across the colonies, from New Hampshire to South Carolina, appointed stamp agents began resigning one by one. Those who didn't were threatened, shunned, or chased away. No one sold the stamps, no one used them. The law could not be enforced. London, autumn 1765. Prime Minister Grenville received wave after wave of letters from colonial governors reporting unrest. Yet he remained firm. If we give in, they'll believe they have power. But divisions were forming in Parliament. Some feared they had set the colonies on an irreversible path. The New World, late 1765. Courts in New Jersey shut down without valid documents. In Rhode Island, merchants refused to trade if contracts bore the stamp. In Charleston, citizens blockaded the harbor, refusing to unload stamped paper. A revolution without guns, but with remarkable impact. That October, for the first time in history, 27 delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York for the Stamp Act Congress, under candlelight in a cramped room. They signed a declaration to King George III. We are loyal to the crown, but the right to tax is a right that cannot be stripped from a free people. One cold morning in Boston, Samuel Adams sat by his window, watching the quiet street below. He whispered, "This act is not just about tax. It is a shackle, and for the first time, I see our people learning how to break it." The Stamp Act didn't just change laws, it awakened a nation. The Sons of Liberty are born Boston. Late autumn of 1765. Crimson leaves drifted in the chilly wind, falling upon the worn cobblestones of King Street. In a small back room behind the Green Dragon Tavern, candlelight flickered across the stern faces of the men gathered around a wooden table. Samuel Adams slowly stood. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice deep yet steady, "if the government no longer represents the people, then the people must rise and represent themselves." No one spoke, but their eyes, burning like embers beneath the frost, were the silent answer. From that night forward, a name began to echo in alleys, taverns, and print shops alike: Sons of Liberty. The movement begins. At first, they were tradesmen, shop owners, printers, lawyers, and merchants sangry, but unorganized. Yet, as the Stamp Act spread, so too did the flames of resentment. Samuel Adams, along with John Hancock, Paul Revere, and James Otis, began to gather like-minded patriots. They had no army, no treasury, but they wielded the most dangerous weapon of all: a unified spirit and the sharp power of words. They met in secret, planning resistance by candlelight. They wrote pamphlets, raised banners, and filled newspapers with scathing essays condemning injustice from London and calling citizens to action. Liberty is not a gift. It must be claimed. Read a headline in the Boston Gazette. The name Sons of Liberty was not their own invention. It began as an insult from a British official. But as Samuel Adams once said, "If they mock us by calling us Sons of Liberty, then let us wear the name like a badge of honor." Soon, Sons of Liberty groups sprang up across the colonies: New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Newport. Each cell acted independently, yet they all shared one purpose: resisting the Stamp Act and defending the right to self-govern. A campaign of defiance. One of their first bold actions was to intimidate royal stamp distributors into resigning. In Boston, Andrew Oliver, the appointed stamp agent, was hanged in effigy from the Liberty Tree, his home ransacked, and he was forced to publicly renounce his post. In other towns, Sons of Liberty paraded through the streets, beating drums and carrying effigies of British officials, staging mock trials in the open. These political performances were brilliant. They stirred public anger while unnerving British authorities. They also called for boycotts of British goods, urging colonists to use domestic products. Female weavers were praised as the daughters of liberty for spinning homespun cloth. From clothes to tea, Paper to ink anything with a British label was treated as betrayal. From protest to coordinations, Sons of Liberty groups began to connect through secret communication networks, sending letters, pamphlets, and plans between the colonies. Paul Revere, with his fast horse and sharp memory, often served as a messenger, carrying news from Boston to far-off towns. They established meeting points in taverns, churches, and even private homes, places where debates, declarations, and action plans were drawn. Clashing with the Crown British authorities grew alarmed. Governors begged for reinforcements. Troops were dispatched to Boston, heightening tensions. But the Sons of Liberty did not back down. They organized Liberty Days, reenactments of protests meant to remind citizens of the stakes. They wrote articles and drew political cartoons, mocking the British government, stirring both fury and hope. One pamphlet boldly proclaimed, "If we do not rise today, our children shall bow tomorrow, and the fault will be ours alone." The first victory through relentless protests, boycotts, and public pressure in March 1766. Parliament was forced to repeal the Stamp Act. Across the colonies, Sons of Liberty celebrated. They burned copies of the law in public bonfires, cheered by crowds. But Samuel Adams warned, "This is only the beginning. They will return, and we must be ready." A spreading legacy that victory set a precedent. Ordinary people, united, could shake an empire. From spontaneous protest, the Sons of Liberty became a symbol of organized resistance. They didn't just oppose a law, they helped birth a new identity. Free Americans. Like a spark on dry kindling, their spirit spread rapidly through the colonies, planting seeds for something far greater. A revolution, a nation, a radical new idea of freedom. The voice of resistance as autumn descended upon the American colonies in 1765. The streets of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew louder, not with celebration, but with anger, defiance, and the growing echo of resistance. The Stamp Act had rattled the fragile trust between Britain and its colonies. And from that tremor arose a powerful and determined voice that would challenge the very core of imperial authority. In Boston, the taverns no longer simply buzzed with gossip or political debate. They roared with righteous indignation. Merchants, lawyers, printers, and farmers gathered nightly, trading news and grievances. It was in these crowded, smoky rooms that a phrase began to circulate, a slogan that soon painted fences, echoed from pulpits, and thundered through the town halls. No taxation without representation. Samuel Adams, a failed brewer turned politician, emerged as a fierce and tireless advocate for colonial rights. Though not yet a household name beyond Massachusetts, his pen and oratory stirred deep passions among his fellow citizens. In newspapers and pamphlets, he framed the Stamp Act not just as a tax, but as a betrayal breach of the rights that every Englishman held dear. Are we not British subjects? He challenged in one essay. Then, where is our voice in Parliament? Meanwhile, in Virginia's House of Burgesses, a young delegate named Patrick Henry stunned the chamber with a bold and fiery speech. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell. He thundered, and George III. Gasps filled the room. Henry paused, then added, "May profit from their example." The implication was clear. The colonies would not bow quietly to injustice. Across the 13 colonies, assemblies and councils began to stir. In towns from Savannah to Portsmouth, petitions were drawn up and delegates selected for a bold new endeavor, the Stamp Act Congress, held in October 1765 in New York City. It marked the first unified political action among the colonies. 9 of the 13 colonies sent representatives, an unprecedented show of solidarity in a land still fragmented by geography, culture, and local loyalties. Among the gathered men were brilliant minds and cautious moderates, but all shared one concern: the erosion of self-rule. In hushed but determined voices, they drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, insisting that only colonial legislatures had the authority to tax their people. The document was formal, almost deferential in tone, but its message struck with precision. The Stamp Act was unconstitutional and must be repealed. Outside the halls of government, ordinary people joined the chorus of protest. Printers like Benjamin Eads and John Gill flooded the streets with handbills and broadsides, using the press as a weapon of resistance. In Boston, church bells tolled not for weddings or funerals, but for liberty. Shopkeepers refused to sell stamped paper. Lawyers refused to process legal documents under the Act. And women, so often overlooked in the chronicles of rebellion, found their voices too. They spun homespun cloth to replace British imports and organized boycotts of British goods. In parlors and at market stalls, they challenged their neighbors. Will you drink tea that costs us our rights? The voices of protest, once scattered and hesitant, had coalesced into a movement. British officials, stunned by the vehemence of the response, found themselves caught between enforcing a law and avoiding open rebellion. The voice of resistance had become a thunderclap, but this was only the beginning. The Stamp Act would not be the last grievance, nor would it be the last time the colonies united in protest. Yet, in this moment, these town halls, taverns, and cobblestone streets, the soul of the American Revolution was born. The people had spoken, and they would not be silenced. Tensions rise. Violence erupts Boston. Late summer of 1765. The heat wasn't only in the air, it smoldered in the streets, in the hearts of merchants, artisans, and laborers alike. Every tavern, every market stall buzzed with one question: will the Stamp Act really be enforced? For weeks, tension had crackled like a storm cloud over Massachusetts. London had sent word that stamps bearing the royal insignia must be used on newspapers. Legal documents, licenses, even playing cards. It was the first internal tax imposed directly by Parliament, and colonists saw it not only as burdensome, but as a direct assault on their rights as Englishmen. That tension erupted on August 14th. At dawn, a crowd gathered beneath a great elm tree on Orange Street in Boston. Suspended from the branches were two effigies, one of Andrew Oliver, the newly appointed stamp distributor, and another of a devil clutching a scroll marked Stamp Act. The symbolism was clear and chilling. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd swelled. Children mimicked the chants of their fathers. Women stood in doorways, watching silently. By midday, the mob had grown to hundreds. They cheered as carpenters and sailors raised a crude platform, and someone set the devil figure aflame. The smell of burning cloth and pitch drifted across the street. No stamps. But they weren't finished. The mob surged toward Oliver's elegant home on Fort Hill. Though he had publicly claimed neutrality, the people saw him as a traitor, willing servant of the crown's tyranny. They tore down his garden fence, smashed windows, and stormed through the front door. Furniture was hurled into the street, his library ripped apart. Only a last-minute intervention from the town, as more moderate leaders, prevented the house from being set ablaze. That night, Oliver resigned in terror. He would never distribute a single stamp. The rebellion didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, a crowd more organized, more emboldened, turned its fury on Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Though Hutchinson had publicly opposed the Stamp Act, many believed he had quietly supported its enforcement. The mob did not hesitate. They began at his brother-in-law's home, Benjamin Hallowell, the controller of customs, and tore it to the ground. Then they descended on Hutchinson's mansion on Garden Court Street. The attack was vicious. Windows shattered. Doors splintered. The ornate staircase was ripped apart. Rare paintings were slashed and trampled. Hutchinson's extensive personal library, years of scholarship and letters, was dumped into the mud. Chests of tea, silverware, bedding, portraits, clocks, everything stolen, broken, burned. Hutchinson and his family barely escaped through a back entrance. The next morning, the streets were littered with scraps of his life, pages of books, cracked picture frames, half-melted candlesticks. Hutchinson, normally a man of measured tones and diplomacy, was devastated. "Had I not fled," he wrote, "I am convinced I would not be alive today." Elsewhere, across the colonies, similar uprisings flared. In New York, Protesters forced the resignation of stamp distributor James McKeevers. In Charleston, they burned effigies and paraded a mock funeral for American liberty. In Philadelphia, they formed committees to boycott British goods. Even in the quiet streets of Providence, Rhode Island, shopkeepers refused to carry any merchandise tied to British taxation. The term Sons of Liberty now spread like wildfire. It soon became a powerful banner, uniting colonists from Massachusetts to Georgia. Men who once disagreed bitterly on politics or religion now stood side by side, writing letters, organizing town meetings, and printing pamphlets condemning Parliament's actions. Their enemy was no longer just a lit, was a principle: taxation without representation. The British government, stunned by the ferocity of resistance, doubled down. Troops were promised. New customs officers were assigned. Secret reports arrived in London, detailing the riots, the burning, the violence. Some in Parliament argued the colonists had gone mad. Others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans were beginning to demand something more dangerous than tax relief: independence. In Boston, Governor Francis Bernard called for calm, but had little power to act. He knew that the British garrison stationed nearby was too small, too wary of escalating tensions into outright war. This, he admitted in a letter to London, is not merely opposition, it is revolution in disguise. By October, when the Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, the air across the colonies had changed. The delegates, 12 men from 9 colonies, met not in secret, but openly, an act of defiance in itself. Together, they drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, addressed not only to the King, but to all of Parliament. Their message was firm: we are loyal British subjects, but we will not accept taxes imposed without our consent. Back in Boston, the Liberty Tree, once just a grand elm, had become a symbol. Every time a new act passed from London, protesters gathered beneath its branches. It became a meeting ground, a sanctuary, a rallying cry. By winter, no stamp distributor in the colonies dared enforce the law. The Stamp Act would remain technically in place until its official repeal in March 1766. But its power had already been shattered, not by negotiation or diplomacy, but by the will of the people, and yes, by violence. The colonies had tasted resistance, discovered their strength, and, for the first time, in the smoky taverns and crowded streets of Boston, a question began to form, not aloud, not yet, but deep in the hearts of many. If we can stand up to Britain on this, what else might we demand? The revolution had not yet come, but its fuse was lit. A step back, but history had already changed. The spring of 1766 brought with it more than just the thawing of snow in the colonies. It brought the long-awaited news that the Stamp Act had been repealed. Church bells rang across towns, taverns were filled with celebratory toasts, and streets echoed with cheers. To many colonists, it felt like a moment of triumph, proof that their voices, their protests, their sacrifices had not been in vain. The great power across the ocean had finally listened. But beneath the celebration was a deep and lasting shift that few could yet fully understand. In London, the repeal had not come easily. Prime Minister George Grenville, architect of the Stamp Act, had already been replaced by Lord Rockingham, a man more cautious and pragmatic. Pressured by merchants whose transatlantic trade had suffered from colonial boycotts, Parliament debated fiercely. While some members still insisted that the colonies must be taxed to help pay for the costs of the empire, others feared that pushing too hard would fracture Britain's control over its distant subjects. Finally, in March 1766, the Stamp Act was formally repealed. However, almost simultaneously, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. To British lawmakers, it was a necessary declaration of sovereignty. But in the colonies, it was a chilling reminder that this victory might be short-lived. In Boston, Samuel Adams watched the celebrations with wary eyes. He had helped organize protests, written fiery articles, and spoken at countless meetings. He had seen how quickly crowds could turn from peaceful to violent, from citizens to mobs. Though the repeal was a victory, Adams sensed that the battle was far from over. The Declaratory Act, he warned in town meetings and letters, was a seed for future oppression. In Virginia, Patrick Henry stood in the House of Burgesses, his words echoing through the wooden chamber. They may have repealed the Stamp Act, but they have not relinquished their claim over us. The spirit of liberty has been awakened, will not sleep again. In New York, John Holt, editor of the New York Gazette, published an editorial titled "The Price of Freedom." He praised the repeal, but reminded readers that it had only come because ordinary colonists, merchants, farmers, printers, dockworkers had stood together, risked their comfort, and in some cases, their lives. "We must remember," he wrote, "that our unity was our power, and if the need comes again, we must be ready." Meanwhile, back in London, voices were rising among the king's advisers, warning that leniency had been perceived as weakness. Lord Charles Townshend, a sharp and ambitious politician, whispered of new taxes, cleverly structured, that would raise revenue without stirring the same outcry. His plans were already forming, and the seeds of the next storm were being quietly sown. Though the streets were calm for now, though trade resumed and ships once again filled the ports, there was a subtle shift in the colonial mind. The Stamp Act crisis had taught the colonists a powerful lesson not only that resistance could work, but that their identities as British subjects were changing. They were no longer content to be seen as dependents of the crown, without voice or rights. They had found within themselves a new sense of agency, of purpose, and of shared destiny. Committees of correspondence were forming in more towns. Pamphlets circulated faster than ever. And behind closed doors in taverns and assembly halls, people began speaking of ideas once unthinkable: autonomy, self-governance, even independence. Back in Boston, an older shopkeeper told a group of apprentices who had helped tear down a stamped distributor as office months before, "You boys were playing at revolution. You didn't know it then, but I think now we all do." And so, while Britain had taken a step back in 1766, hoping to restore calm, the colonies had already stepped onto a different path. The fire that had been lit by a simple tax on paper had illuminated something far greater: the hunger for liberty. History, once nudged from its course, would not return to the old road. Seeds of revolution in March 1766, when news arrived that the British Parliament had repealed the Stamp Act. Church bells rang out across the colonies from Boston to Charleston. People gathered in the streets to celebrate, and bonfires of joy lit up the night sky. The British flag still flew on the masts and government buildings, but in many hearts something had shifted irreversibly. In taverns and on street corners, people didn't just chant slogans for liberty. They began asking questions that, until recently, would have been seen as dangerous. If Parliament had no right to tax them, what else didn't it have the right to do? If they had no representatives in Westminster, were they truly obligated to obey British laws? Among the loudest voices rising above the celebrations was a name, quickly becoming known throughout the colonies: Samuel Adams, no longer just an organizer of protests or writer of anonymous pamphlets. Adams had become a symbol of focused and principled resistance. In secret meetings of the Sons of Liberty, he warned, "We have won a step back, but only because of pressure. If we grow complacent in victory, we may lose everything." Down in Virginia, Patrick Henry, the fiery orator who had once dared to declare, "If this be treason, make the most of it," continued pressing the House of Burgesses to strengthen colonial assemblies. He warned fellow delegates that the repeal was only a temporary appeasement. Britain would surely find new ways to tighten its grip, and he was right. Alongside the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament quietly passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a declaration of absolute authority. For many in the colonies, it sounded like a veiled threat of confirmation that the imperial system wasn't merely flawed, but fundamentally hostile to American self-government. In this atmosphere of tension and renewed vigilance, colonial newspapers flourished. Independent presses sprang up, printing essays by bold new voices like John Dickinson, whose letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania challenged British authority while calling for unity. Others published under pseudonyms like Cato and Brutus, evoking the ancient Roman defenders of republican liberty. Their words stirred a new kind of patriotism, not loyalty to Britain, but allegiance to the land and the principles of freedom taking root in America. In schools and churches, youth were taught not that they were mere subjects of a distant monarch, but that they were born with inalienable rights, liberty, representation, and the right to govern themselves. What once belonged only to philosophers now became a rallying cry in daily life. Then came 1767, the British Parliament, still seeking revenue and control, passed the Townshend Acts, imposing duties on imported goods like glass, paper, and tea. The reaction was swift and strategic. Americans began to boycott British products. They spun their own cloth and brewed their own tea. In New England, women gathered for spinning bees, turning homespun fabric into a badge of honor and economic independence. In port cities like Boston, the movement grew bolder. Merchants refused to unload British goods. Artisans hung signs in shop windows declaring their products made in the colonies. The protest had matured, less a riot in the streets, more a sustained act of economic and political defiance. Meanwhile, colonial assemblies passed resolutions asserting their exclusive right to legislate for local affairs. In Massachusetts, a fiery pamphlet penned by Adams declared, "No taxation without representation is not just a slogan, it is the essence of our natural rights." By the decade's end, the seeds of revolution had taken root in fertile ground. No one seriously believed things would simply go back to normal. Every town meeting, every newspaper editorial, every boycott and petition was a blow to the old order and a step toward something new. The colonists had not yet declared independence, but the idea of it, once unthinkable now, hovered in the air. From the parlor rooms of Philadelphia to the fields of rural Connecticut, farmers, lawyers, and tradesmen alike spoke of liberty as something real, not abstract. They saw their own assemblies as legitimate governments. They looked to each other, not London, for leadership. What had begun as opposition to a single tax had become a movement of identity and destiny. The colonists were no longer merely protesting British overreach. They were imagining themselves as a separate people, with a future that could no longer be dictated from across the ocean. A revolution had not yet erupted, but it had begun to bloom.